Welcome to Sleep Stories by Oliver Penn. I am your host, and you have found your way here at exactly the right hour. This is a place built for the end of the day, for the moment when the world outside finally quiets, and something softer is permitted to take its place. Before we begin tonight, I would be glad to know where you are listening from. Leave a word in the comments if you like. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in different corners of the world are settling into the same story at the same hour. If you find rest here, consider subscribing. New stories arrive regularly, and there will always be a lamp lit and a chair waiting. Now, set everything down. Whatever the day has left behind, let it wait until morning. It will keep. Make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes if you are ready, and take one slow breath. Tonight, I will take you somewhere unhurried, somewhere the light is always amber, the rooms are always warm, and the night outside is always still. All you need to do is listen. The solicitor's letter had arrived on a Wednesday. Thomas Hale had read it at his desk in Bloomsbury, in the small cluttered study that had once been the room where he wrote and was now simply the room where he sat. The letter was brief, as letters from solicitors tended to be when the news was neither complicated nor welcome. His uncle, Robert Hale, gamekeeper of the Oldham Moor estate in the North Riding of Yorkshire, had died on the 14th of November, quietly and without fuss, in the manner of a man who had lived his entire life without fuss and saw no reason to change his habits at the end of it. He had left no wife, no children, and no other living relatives. The lodge and its contents passed by the terms of a will drawn up 30 years ago and never revised, to Thomas. Thomas had set the letter down on his desk and looked at it for a long time. He had met his uncle perhaps 4 times in his life. Robert Hale had been his father's younger brother, a man who had chosen the north over London before Thomas was born, and had by all accounts never reconsidered the choice. He was not an unfriendly man, from what Thomas could remember, simply a man who belonged entirely to where he was, and for whom the distance between Yorkshire and Bloomsbury was not merely geographical, but constituted a difference in kind, in the way that certain people inhabit the world differently from certain other people, and both parties understand this without needing to discuss it. Thomas had not seen him in 11 years. He had not written in 6. He looked at the letter. He looked at the window, which showed the grey November street below, the plane trees bare, a woman with an umbrella walking quickly past, the ordinary London afternoon doing what London afternoons did in November, which was to make everything feel slightly more permanent than it actually was. He thought, I should go up and see to things. He thought, I have nothing else to do. Both of these things were true, and the second of them was the more uncomfortable truth, and had been the more uncomfortable truth for longer than he cared to examine carefully. He was 48 years old. He had published 4 books of natural history writing, the last of them 7 years ago. He had not written anything of substance since. His editor, a patient man named Graves, who had been patient for considerably longer than patience could reasonably be expected to last, had stopped asking about the new manuscript 8 months ago, which Thomas understood to mean something he was not yet ready to think about directly. He folded the letter. He put it in his coat pocket. He went to make arrangements for the journey north. The train to York departed from King's Cross at 8:30 in the morning. Thomas sat by the window with his notebook open on his knee, which was the position he had maintained for 7 years without writing anything in it of consequence. The notebook was a habit he could not relinquish. The way certain habits persist long after the purpose that generated them has gone quiet. He watched London thin and dissolve, the terraces giving way to the wider streets of the outer city giving way to fields, the fields to the particular landscape of the English Midlands in November, which was not beautiful exactly, but had a kind of honesty about it, a willingness to be exactly what it was without apology. He thought about his uncle. Robert Hale had been a gamekeeper for 40 years, first on an estate in Derbyshire, and then, for the last 30 years of his life, on the Alden Moor estate in the North Riding. Thomas knew this from his father, who had spoken of his brother occasionally and always with a mixture of affection and bewilderment, the way one speaks of someone whose choices one respects without understanding. He chose it, his father had said once, when Thomas was perhaps 12. He went up there and he chose it. And that was that. Some people know what they are for. Thomas had written that down at the time in an early notebook, with the instinct of a boy who sensed that certain sentences were worth keeping. Some people know what they are for. He had not written it down since, but he had thought about it a great deal, and thought about it more in recent years, and was thinking about it now on the train to York, with the Midlands passing outside the window and the notebook open and empty on his knee. He changed trains at York and again at a smaller station whose name he did not catch, and by the time he reached the market town of Helmsley, the afternoon light was already the particular amber grey of a Yorkshire November at 3 o'clock, the kind of light that suggested the day had made its decision and was in the process of implementing it. A trap was waiting for him, arranged by the solicitor, driven by a man of perhaps 65, with the weathered, unhurried manner of someone who had been driving traps in Yorkshire for 40 years and intended to continue. He loaded Thomas's trunk without comment and drove without speaking, which suited Thomas very well. The road north from Helmsley rose steadily into the moors. The heather was finished for the year, the moor wearing its winter colours, the deep amber brown of spent bracken, the dark olive of the wiry grass, the occasional black of a peat cutting against the pale sky. The dry stone walls ran along the hillsides in their long, patient lines. A curlew called somewhere in the middle distance, that particular sound that belongs entirely to high moorland and nowhere else, the sound that makes a person feel simultaneously very small and very present. Thomas had not been to Yorkshire in 20 years. He had forgotten this. The particular quality of the light here, lower and more direct than London light, falling on the landscape without mediation, and the way the space opened out in every direction, the horizon very wide, the sky very much a participant rather than merely a backdrop. He had his notebook out. He was not writing in it, but he was holding it, which was more than he usually managed. The lodge appeared at the end of a track that turned off the main moorland road between two old stone gateposts, their tops worn smooth by a century of weather. The track was narrow, grass growing down the centre, the wheel ruts on either side deep and well established, the track of a place that was used regularly and had no need to announce itself. The gamekeeper's lodge sat at the end of the track, in a slight hollow of the moor, sheltered to the north by a stand of old Scots pines whose trunks were the colour of old copper in the low afternoon light. It was a stone building, single story at the front and rising to 2 stories at the back, where the land fell away, built of the local dark millstone grit, the same stone as the walls, as everything up here, as if the buildings had simply been assembled from what the moor provided. A slate roof, very steeply pitched, 2 windows at the front, small paned, the glass old enough to have developed the slight waviness that comes with age, a door of dark oak, very solid, with an iron handle worn smooth at the grip. Beside the door, a boot scraper of wrought iron in the shape of a fox. Thomas looked at it for a moment. The fox was very well made, very particular, the expression alert and slightly amused. It had the quality of something made by someone who had looked at foxes very carefully for a long time. The driver set his trunk down and drove away without ceremony. Thomas stood before the lodge with his trunk and his carpet bag and the November wind coming off the moor at his back, and looked at the building that was now, by the terms of a will drawn up 30 years ago, his. He put the key in the lock. The smell that reached him when he opened the door was not what he expected. He had expected the smell of a closed house, the flat, stale air of rooms that have been empty for 3 weeks since his uncle's death. He had expected damp, perhaps, and cold, and the particular sadness of abandoned spaces. What he found instead was wood smoke, faint but present, the smell of a fire that had burned recently and had been allowed to go out, the warm ghost of it still in the air, and beneath that, something else. Something he could not immediately identify. Something clean and slightly resinous, like the air in a pine forest after rain. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then he went inside. The lodge was a single room downstairs, larger than the outside suggested, with a low ceiling of old timber and a wide stone fireplace at the far end, in which the fire had indeed burned recently. The ash was still grey rather than white, the logs not fully reduced. A chair pulled close to the hearth, a good chair, the leather worn dark and soft with decades of use. A table against the wall with 2 chairs, a dresser holding a small collection of mismatched plates and cups, a bookshelf beside the fireplace, full but orderly, a lamp on the table, unlit. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a row of objects, a small brass compass, a bird's egg blown and faded to a pale cream, a piece of quartz, very white, the size of a fist, a worn leather strap with a brass buckle, a folded piece of paper. Thomas set his bag down. He went to the mantelpiece. He picked up the folded paper. It was a note, written in a hand he did not recognize, but which had the quality of someone who wrote regularly and with intention. Not an educated hand exactly, but a careful one. The hand of a man who took the business of writing seriously, without having been taught to take it elegantly. If you are Thomas, welcome. I have been meaning to write to you for some time. The kindling is in the box to the left of the hearth. The lamp takes the oil from the can on the shelf above the dresser. The spring is 20 yards behind the lodge. Follow the sound. There is food in the larder. The damp patch on the north wall is worse than it looks, which is to say, it is not bad at all. The notebook on the desk in the upstairs room is not private. You may read it if you wish. I think perhaps you should. Your uncle, Robert. Thomas read it twice. He stood for a long time with the note in his hand, looking at the fireplace, at the grey ash of a fire that had been laid and lit and allowed to burn and had gone out quietly in the 3 weeks since the man who had written this note had died. He had laid the fire himself. Before he died, knowing he was going to die, he had laid the fire and written the note and folded it and placed it on the mantelpiece where it would be found. Thomas set the note down carefully beside the brass compass. He went to find the kindling. The fire took quickly, the kindling dry and well chosen, the logs of a size that suggested someone who understood fire, who had thought about what a fire needed and had prepared accordingly. Thomas lit the lamp from the oil can on the shelf, adjusting the wick until the light was steady and warm. He found bread and cheese and a crock of butter in the larder and a bottle of ale, and ate at the table by the window as the November dark came fully down outside and the moor disappeared into the night. The lodge was very quiet, quieter than anything he had experienced in a very long time. London was never quiet in the way this was quiet. London had a continuous ambient sound, a low hum of the city being alive, that you ceased to hear consciously after a while, but that was always there. Here there was no hum. There was the fire, which crackled and shifted in its methodical way. There was the wind across the moor, which had its own voice, low and unhurried. And there was a silence beneath these things that was not the absence of sound, but something more like the presence of stillness, the particular quality of a place that had been quiet for a long time and knew how to be quiet. He found himself, without intending to, opening his notebook. He did not write anything, but he sat for a long time with it open, which was more than he had managed in months. Amnesty. After supper, he went upstairs. The staircase was narrow and steep, the treads worn smooth in the center. The upper floor was a single room, smaller than the one below, with a low ceiling that followed the pitch of the roof, and 2 small windows, one looking north over the moor and one looking east toward the woods. A bed with a heavy wool quilt, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and in the corner by the east window, a desk. On the desk, a notebook. It was a large notebook, the covers of dark green oilcloth, the kind designed to be carried in outdoor conditions, to resist damp and rough handling. It was well used. The spine was creased in the way of something opened many thousands of times. The edges of the pages were slightly irregular, the paper good quality, the sort that held ink well. Thomas sat down at the desk. He looked at the notebook for a long time without touching it. Outside the east window, the darkness was complete, the Yorkshire night having arrived without ceremony and settled in with the confidence of something that knew it had the whole night ahead of it. He opened the notebook. The first entry was dated the 3rd of April, 1851. First day at Aldenmoor. The estate is larger than I had understood from the description. Walked the eastern boundary this morning, 7 miles, the ground still soft from the winter. Saw 2 pairs of red grouse on the high moor, 1 hen harrier hunting the valley bottom, a fox den in the old earthwork on the south slope, fresh. The head forester is a man named Birch, taciturn but seems to know his ground. I think we shall get along. The lodge is good. The north wall has a damp patch that will need attention. Thomas smiled at this. The north wall, still the same damp patch, 30 years later, exactly as his uncle had described it in the note on the mantelpiece. He had lived with it for 30 years and had apparently regarded it as a fixed and acceptable feature of the place, like the angle of the roof or the depth of the fireplace. He read on. The notebook covered 30 years of observation, 30 years of daily entries, brief and precise, recording what Robert Hale had seen and done and noted in the course of his work on the Aldenmoor estate. The entries had the quality Thomas recognized from the best natural history writing, not his own, which had become careful and self-conscious in recent years, but the writing he had admired in others, the writing that came from genuine attention rather than from the arrangement of attention into something literary. His uncle had not been trying to write. He had simply been recording what he saw in the plainest language available to him because he thought it worth recording. And what he had seen was extraordinary, not dramatic, not the kind of extraordinary that announced itself. The quiet extraordinary of a man who had spent 30 years paying very close attention to a specific piece of ground and had, in doing so, come to know it in a way that very few people come to know anything. The grouse populations and their fluctuations across 3 decades, the slow return of the curlew to the eastern moor after years of absence, the fox family in the old earthwork on the south slope, followed across multiple generations, the cubs of 1 year becoming the adults of the next, the territory shifting and contracting and expanding with the years. The way the moor changed across the seasons, not just the obvious changes, the heather flowering in August, the bracken dying back in October, but the subtler changes, the way the light fell differently in February than in March, the way the wind moved differently across the moor in early spring before the new growth came. Thomas read through the evening. He did not notice the fire burning low downstairs. He did not notice the cold settling into the room around him. He read the way he had not read anything in years, with the full and unguarded attention of someone who has found exactly the thing he needed without knowing he needed it. He found the missing page on the second night. He had been reading through the 1870s, following the threads his uncle had laid down across the years, the accumulated detail of a life spent in close attention to one place, when he noticed it, between 2 pages that were otherwise continuous in their sequence, a gap. Not an accidental gap, not a torn page or a missing leaf, a deliberate removal. The paper had been cut cleanly, close to the binding, with something sharp, a knife perhaps, carefully done. The entry before it ended on a Wednesday in March of 1878. The entry after it began on a Friday of the same week. Thursday was gone. Thomas held the notebook to the lamp. He could see the faintest ghost of the removed page in the binding, the thin edge of paper left where the cut had been made. He could see, very faintly, on the back of the Friday entry, the impression of writing from the missing page, pressed through by the pen. The impressions were too faint to read. He sat for a long time with the notebook open at the gap. Thursday, March the 14th, 1878, the night of the great storm. He knew this because the Wednesday entry ended with a note about the weather. barometer falling sharply since noon, wind picking up from the northwest. There will be a storm tonight. And the Friday entry began. The storm took 3 of the old pines on the north side of the lodge. The damage to the eastern wall of the far covert is considerable. We'll need 2 weeks of work to clear, between these 2 entries, the storm itself, and whatever his uncle had written about it, removed. Thomas set the notebook down carefully on the desk. He looked at the east window, which showed him nothing but his own reflection in the dark glass. He thought about a man who had kept a meticulous daily record for 30 years and had removed a single page, not lost it, removed it, deliberately, carefully, with a knife. He went to bed later than he had intended. He lay in the darkness with the wool quilt pulled up and listened to the wind across the moor, which was not a storm, simply the ordinary November wind, persistent and unhurried, moving across the heather with the sound of something that had been doing this for a very long time and would continue to do it long after every person who had ever listened to it was gone. He thought about the missing page. He thought about the storm. He thought about 30 years of faithful record and 1 deliberate removal. He was asleep before he had finished the thought. On the 3rd morning, Thomas walked the estate. He had no particular plan. He took his coat and his notebook, more from habit than intention, and went out into the November morning, which was cold and very clear, the air sharp enough to make the colours of the moor more vivid than they would otherwise have been, the amber of the bracken very bright, the dark of the peat very dark, the sky a pale washed blue with a quality of light that belonged entirely to the north of England in winter, clear without warmth, bright without comfort, the light of a sky that has no interest in flattering anything and is simply being what it is. He walked east, toward the woods that his uncle's notebook described in such careful detail across 3 decades. The woods were a mixed planting, oak and ash and rowan in the lower ground, the Scots pines on the higher slopes, the same pines that sheltered the lodge to the north. His uncle had known every tree in them, apparently. Reading the notebook, Thomas had found entries that referred to specific trees by location and sometimes by something like character. The old ash at the bend of the stream that always leafed 2 weeks later than its neighbours, the rowan at the top of the East Ride, whose berries the fieldfares stripped every October with particular enthusiasm. Thomas walked slowly, looking. He had not looked at a landscape carefully in a very long time. He had been in landscapes, had passed through them, but the looking, the particular deliberate attention that was the foundation of everything he had once been able to write, had gone quiet in him, and he had not known how to get it back, and had eventually stopped trying. But this morning, in the cold, clear light of the Yorkshire moor, he found himself looking. He found the old ash at the bend of the stream, exactly where his uncle had described it. It was bare now, November having stripped it entirely, but the shape of it was exactly as the notebook suggested, the particular angle of the main limbs, the slight lean to the south. Thomas stood beside it for a long time. He took out his notebook. He wrote, "The ash at the stream bend, exactly as described. The bark darker than I expected, almost black in this light. The stream below it is very clear, running fast over pale stones." He looked at what he had written. It was not much, but it was true, and it was specific, and it was the first thing he had written in his notebook that was worth writing in longer than he could precisely remember. He walked on. He found the eastern field at mid-morning. It was a large field by moorland standards, perhaps 15 acres, enclosed on 3 sides by the old drustone walls and open to the moor on the 4th. The grass here was different from the moor grass, longer and softer, the kind of grass that suggested better ground beneath, more sheltered, more nourishing. He stood at the wall and looked at the field. He had been thinking about the missing page, about his uncle's note in the margin of the Wednesday entry, "There will be a storm tonight," and about something else he had found, reading back through the notebook the previous evening, in the years before 1878, scattered across the entries for March, a recurring notation, brief, unremarkable in itself, easy to pass over if you were not looking for it, but Thomas had been looking, without quite knowing he was. The stag came to the eastern field again. He had found this notation 11 times across the years between 1851 and 1878, always in March, always in the eastern field, always the same phrasing, the same careful neutral tone his uncle used for all his observations, not excited, not wondering, simply recording. The stag came to the eastern field again, and then, after March 1878, nothing. The notation did not appear again. In the 15 years of entries after the missing page, the eastern field was mentioned frequently. His uncle had clearly walked it regularly, but the stag was never referred to again. Thomas stood at the wall of the eastern field in the November morning and thought about this. He had been to the eastern field the previous afternoon on his first exploratory walk and had noticed nothing in particular, but he had not been looking then, not with the attention the field apparently merited. He looked now. The grass, long and pale, the walls, very old, the stones settled into themselves with the solidity of things that have been where they are for a very long time, the moor beyond the open side, stretching away to the horizon, and then he saw it. Not a stag. It was November, the wrong time of year, and besides he had read enough of his uncle's notebook to know that what he was looking at was not that kind of sign. It was a path, or rather, the suggestion of a path, barely visible in the long grass of the field, a slight depression running from the open moorland side of the field, diagonally across to the far wall, where the stones of the wall were arranged slightly differently from the rest of it, a gap that had been filled in at some point, but filled in differently, the stones newer, the mortar visible, a gap that had been closed. Thomas walked the length of the suggested path. He crouched at the wall where the gap had been filled. The mortar was not recent, but was considerably newer than the surrounding stonework. He straightened and looked back along the path, the slight depression in the grass, barely there but present. He took out his notebook. He wrote for a long time. He found the answer in the notebook that evening, but not where he had expected to find it. He had been searching the entries around the time of the storm, rereading the weeks before and after March 1878, looking for anything his uncle might have recorded that would explain the missing page. He had found nothing obvious. The entries before the storm were the ordinary faithful record of an ordinary march on the Alden Moor moors. The entries after it were similarly unremarkable, focused on the practical work of clearing the storm damage. But then, in the final pages of the notebook, the entries for the last months of his uncle's life, he found it. His uncle had known he was dying. This was clear from the entries, which did not discuss the fact directly. His uncle was not a man who discussed things directly, but which had a quality different from the earlier entries, a kind of deliberateness, a sense of a man who is making a record with the knowledge that it will be read after he is gone, rather than simply because the habit of recording is ingrained. And in an entry dated the 2nd of September of that year, 3 months before he died, his uncle had written this: "I have been thinking about the eastern field, about the stag and the gap in the wall, and the night of the storm in March of 1878. I removed the page I wrote that night because I did not know at the time what to do with what I had seen, and writing it down felt like a claim I was not prepared to make. I have had 30 years to think about it since. I believe now that the not writing it was the wrong decision. A record that omits the thing that changed everything is not a record, but a performance. I will not rewrite it. I am too old and my hand is not steady enough for the kind of writing it would require. But I will say this: the stag came to the eastern field on the night of the storm for the last time. It had been coming every March for 27 years, always to the same place, always through the same gap in the wall. That night in the storm, I went out to watch as I had watched every year, and I understood something that I had been seeing for 27 years without understanding. The field was not simply a place the stag came to. It was a place the stag came to and was known, whatever that means. I have spent 30 years trying to find the right words for it, and I have not found them. Perhaps Thomas will. He is better with words than I ever was. That is why I left him the notebook." Thomas sat at the desk for a very long time, Outside, the Yorkshire night was absolutely still. The wind had dropped entirely, which happened sometimes on the moor, a complete cessation that felt almost deliberate, as though the moor had decided to hold its breath for a moment. The lamp burned steadily on the desk. The notebook lay open before him. He thought about his uncle, who had watched a stag come to the same field for 27 years and had understood something about it that he could not put into words, and who had removed the page on which he had tried, and who had spent 30 years regretting the removal, and who had left the notebook for Thomas with the specific hope that Thomas might find the words that had eluded him. He thought about the path in the grass, barely visible, the trace of something that had been done many times over many years, the gap in the wall that had been closed after the last visit. He thought about his uncle going out in the storm to watch, in the dark and the wind and the rain, the way he had gone out every March for 27 years, because the watching mattered to him in a way he could not explain and had never tried to explain to anyone. He thought about the notebook in his own bag, open and empty for 7 years. He thought about the ash tree at the stream bend and what he had written about it that morning, small and true and specific, the first thing worth writing in a very long time. He thought about what his uncle had written, a record that amidst the thing that changed everything is not a record, but a performance. He picked up his pen. He opened his own notebook to the first blank page. He began to write. Not about the stag. He did not know about the stag, not in the way his uncle had known it, not yet. He wrote about the eastern field, about the path in the grass, about the wall and the closed gap, and the particular quality of a place where something has happened many times over many years, the way that repetition leaves a kind of presence in a landscape, not supernatural, not strange, simply the accumulated weight of attention paid to the same ground again and again across time. He wrote for 2 hours. He did not stop to reread. He did not stop to consider whether what he was writing was good. He simply wrote, in the way he had once written before the carefulness had come and the writing had stopped, with the full and unguarded attention of a man who has found the thing he needed. When he stopped, he sat for a moment and looked at what he had written. It was not finished. It was not even properly begun. But it was real, and it was specific, and it came from the ground on which he was sitting, from the 30 years of his uncle's notebook, from the path in the eastern field and the closed gap in the wall and the stag that had come every March for 27 years to a place where it was known. He closed the notebook. He went to the window and looked out at the moor. The night was very dark and very still. The stars were extraordinary up here, more stars than he ever saw in London, the kind of sky that required a place with no competing light to reveal itself properly. He thought, I will stay for a while longer. He thought it without drama, without the weight of a significant decision, simply as the next reasonable thing. The lodge was his, the notebook was his, the eastern field and the ash tree and the moorland track and the 30 years of his uncle's faithful record were all, in some sense, his now, passed to him by a man he had barely known, who had apparently known him better than he had realized, who had left him exactly what he needed in a note on a mantelpiece and a notebook on a desk and a gap in the record that needed filling. He went to bed. He lay in the darkness and listened to the moor, which had resumed its wind, low and steady, the sound of the heather moving in the dark, the sound of the pines on the north side of the lodge shifting in the way that pines shift, their particular deep sighing. He thought about March, about the eastern field in March when the year was turning and the light was returning to the moor, about what it would be like to stand in that field in March and watch for something that had not come in 15 years and might not come again. He thought he would find out. He closed his eyes. The lodge settled around him, the old stone and old timber, doing what they did in the night, the small adjustments, the quiet exhalations of a building that had been keeping this particular kind of quiet for a very long time and knew exactly how to do it. The lamp burned low downstairs. The notebook lay on the desk with its new pages beginning to fill. The brass compass on the mantelpiece caught a last reflection of the dying fire, and held it briefly, a small warm point of light in the dark room. And then the fire went out, and there was only the dark, and the wind, and the stars above the moor, and the particular silence of a place that had been waiting for someone to arrive and pay attention, and had now, at last, been given what it was waiting for. And that is where we leave the Gamekeeper's lodge tonight, in the stillness of a Yorkshire moor, in the amber light of a lamp burning low, in the quiet of a man who has found the thing he needed, in the notebook of a man he barely knew. The eastern field is dark now, the stars are out. The wind moves across the heather in its low, unhurried way. Sleep now, the moor will keep, the notebook will keep, and somewhere in the north of England, a November night holds everything gently, as it always has. Rest well.